Welcome everyone. In today's session, we are going to demystify the concept of an AI model in a clear and straightforward way. The goal is that you should be able to have an intuitive understanding of what an AI model is, even if you are not into tech. By the end of this short session, you'll have a good intuitive sense of why an AI model is compared to a human brain, even though there are some very important differences. You have most likely heard of AI models driving cars, detecting diseases, writing essays, creating art, being able to help you with your emails, etc. Behind all of these AI applications, there is something called an AI model. It's often called the brain of the AI application. But unlike human brains, it's actually more like a file that just sits in your computer, somewhat like a PDF file or a Word file or an audio file. It's more close to that than it is to a human brain. To elaborate further, the comparison of an AI model to a file on your computer is quite nuanced. A file like a PDF or an audio file, when you click on it, there is a software that reads these files and it'll either play music or display the PDF, and you can read the contents of the PDF on your computer. An AI model, on the other hand, requires data to get triggered and make predictions. So what's inside this model? So an AI model is essentially a very organized set of instructions, like a flowchart or a blueprint, which is called the model architecture. Along with this are numbers that are associated with this architecture. The model architecture and the numbers come together and respond to any request for prediction. So for example, if you have a model architecture that can detect a cat or a dog in an image, then when you provide a new image to this model, the model looks at the pixel values of this image, and there are precise instructions in the flowchart along with the numbers associated with it, which will process the pixels of this image and give you an output where it predicts if there is a cat or a dog in the image. So essentially, the numbers that are inside this model are responsible for how the incoming information is processed by the model and how predictions are made. Now, you may have heard that there are models out there which have 250 billion parameters. These parameters are the numbers that we are talking about. These are the numbers that are associated with the model, and when someone says that there are 250 billion such numbers, it means that the model architecture is so complex that it needs so many numbers to be able to process the incoming information. Then the next question is, what are the values of these numbers? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 0.5? What are these numbers? A bulk of the investment and intellectual property lies in figuring out what these numbers are. If you can figure out the optimal value of these numbers that enable the model to do a specific task, then you have solved the problem. And this is where a bulk of the challenge lies in. Before going into the details of how one can know what these numbers are and how it works, let's dive a little bit deeper into the model itself. For now, we are going to assume that you have been given the ideal set of numbers that a model is associated with, which means now you have the model architecture, which is the flowchart, and all the numbers associated with it as well. Let's look at how the model processes incoming information to provide a prediction. So there are two fundamental assumptions about a model that are not stated explicitly. They're not outright there, but they're essential to understand how a model operates. The first one is that an AI model only understands numbers. So the input could be anything like an image or an audio or a text file. Everything is converted into numbers behind the scenes before it is provided as an input to the model. The second is that the order of these numbers matters. Just like you cannot bake a cake by throwing in random ingredients in random order, there is a certain order in which you need to mix things, right, in order to bake the cake. So similarly, there is a certain order in which you're supposed to provide the model with this information. A natural question might be, who decides this order? How do we know what this order is? So when you create the model, and when you figure out what the numbers inside the model should be, it's at that point that the order of the numbers or the order of the information being given to the model is fixed. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now that we know these assumptions about a model, let's look a little bit deeper to understand what's inside the AI model. Consider a simple example. Imagine a model that is associated with just 2 numbers. Now that's a very tiny fraction compared to 250 billion numbers, but let's start with this because it extends to a much bigger model as well. So what we see here with this simple model applies to something which has 250 billion parameters as well. So let's say there are just 2 numbers and let's call them W1 and W2. Let's also make an assumption that this model takes only 1 number as an input and provides 1 number as an output. Altering these 2 numbers W1 and W2 that are associated with the model, it will make the model to predict differently. So for the same input value, which is a single number here, you're going to get a completely different output depending on what the value of W1 and W2 are. Somewhat like tuning the knobs of a radio station. When you tune it, you can listen to different channels. Similarly, when you tweak these values of W1 and W2, you get different behavior of the model, even though the model architecture here is exactly the same. However, it's important to know that when you're making predictions using a model, the values of this W1 and W2 are fixed. In fact, a combination of these values with the model architecture is what makes the model a model. This principle means that many different models can share the same architecture but behave very differently, solving completely different types of problems. So if we go back to our example of having W1 and W2, those of you who are familiar with linear algebra will see that this is essentially the simple equation of a line. However, depending on what the value of W1 and W2 are, you get lines with different orientations and positions. Can this be called an AI model though? Well, this is a simple machine learning model. But using this example, it is possible to explain what happens inside a much bigger model which may have millions or billions of numerical values associated with it. In that case, they may not be linearly connected to each other, like how we saw in this example. There could be a lot of nonlinear mathematical functions inside the model, but essentially, it is a set of instructions accompanied by numbers, which processes incoming numbers. So if we take the example of an image, where a model takes the image as an input, the pixel values of the image are the numbers that this model processes. And this goes through a lot of mathematical operations internally, consisting again of several different numerical values and linear and nonlinear mathematical functions. This is the architecture of the model, which is associated with a bunch of numbers processing the information of these pixels. So if you have a model that has been trained on cats and dogs and it can detect if there is a cat or a dog, you could take the exact same model and train it instead to detect if there is a tumor in an MRI image or not. These models can share the exact same architecture, but the numbers associated with these architectures could be different. So if you give a model that detects a cat or a dog to detect if there is a tumor in an MRI image, it will still say a cat or a dog. This is a classic example of garbage in, garbage out. If you provide a model with nonsensical input, it will provide you with a nonsensical output. In the mind of the model, numbers are coming in, they're being processed exactly the same way, and then a prediction comes as an output. It will predict a cat or a dog in an MRI image, unless it has been explicitly trained to say, I don't know. This leads us to the next topic. How does one know what are the set of numbers that should be associated with the model for it to do a specific task? The process of figuring this out is called training. During the process of training, the model is fed with a very large amount of data, where you provide it with the question as well as the answer. So for example, you could provide it with a lot of images of cat and then tell the model that when an image like this comes in, you're supposed to predict a cat, versus if an image of this type comes in, you're supposed to predict a dog. So you provide tons of information to the model and help the model to figure out what these numbers associated with it should be. This process of learning what these numbers should be by using a ton of information is called training. And if you go into the details of how this is done, it's a little bit like trial and error. You try out different numbers and see how much you're off from where the model is supposed to be. If it was supposed to predict a cat or a dog for a certain image, how many times is it doing it correctly? And how far off it is from where it needs to be. And then you tweak these numbers. But you don't do it arbitrarily. If you try to do it randomly, it would take forever to figure out a model that could solve any task. There is a solid mathematical foundation of how this is done. It's called gradient descent. We are not going to go into the details of gradient descent, but think about it as tuning several knobs. Like in case of a radio, it's a single knob, but in case of a model, it can be a million knobs, which you're tuning and turning to figure out a combination that will get you closest to the task that you're trying to accomplish. And this can be done through a process called gradient descent. Gradient descent propagates the errors that the model is producing backwards, like feedback to the model, so that it can update these values of the knobs or numbers and get to a place where the model makes good predictions. Another important thing to know is that the quality of the data that you provide to the model matters quite a bit. Again, a little bit like the cake example. The quality of the ingredients matters, no matter how good your recipe is. Your model architecture may be an amazing complex architecture which can truly capture the patterns of your data, but the data that you're providing itself needs to be good. If it's flawed or poor quality with a lot of errors, then that's not going to produce a great performing model, even if the architecture was complex. The quality of the data is important. Even the best architecture of a model cannot produce a good result if the quality of the data is bad. Once you have trained a model, then you can save the model. In which case, you're not only saving the architecture of the model, but also the numbers associated with the model. This saved model can then be loaded by a program in the future in order to make predictions on new incoming data. Whether the model is classifying an animal in an image or whether there is a tumor in an image, it works well only if it is trained with the right data. So that's it. An AI model is essentially a blueprint or an architecture that is filled with numbers to help it understand the information that it gets as an input. Thanks for watching, and I hope this makes the AI model a little bit less mysterious to understand.